Welcome back to Paw Patrol with your host, Dr. Jeff Dykes. Tonight I'm joined by Dr. Tim Yoho. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Looking forward to it over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were the dean at Des Moines University when I matriculated through and have since retired. But let's go back a ways and kind of talk about how you kind of became involved in the field of podiatry way back when.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. I went to my undergraduate school was a small private school in Western PA, and I think my parents thought I majored in sports. I played football and baseball, and even my senior year, the football coach was a wrestling coach, and he knew I wrestled in high school, so he asked me to wrestle senior year because they didn't have 190 pounders, so I lost about 15 pounds and wrestled.
Oh, nice.
And I actually won enough matches. I qualified for the small college nationals, and some guy from Wartburg beat me. I didn't know Wartburg from any other school, and so I majored in biology. When I figured out that I wasn't going to play any professional sports, my next step was to go to Duquesne University, which you and Ashley are familiar with, I think, with your residency training.
Very much so. Very much so.
I completed a master's degree in biology with sort of a concentration in microbiology. And then after that, I took a position as a research assistant at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine and / public health. Mm-hmm. And that's where I really learned different research skills and techniques. And it was about that time that the PhD students at Pitt were saying, you don't want to do this because they keep you here for 7 or 8 years. Maybe, that's what you had to look forward to, or you could look into something else. And so I can't remember. Go ahead.
What were you looking at? What were you thinking about doing back then when you were in biology and all that stuff? Before you found podiatry, what were you anticipating doing?
I thought I would be involved in academics and teaching in some form. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what. My father was a professor at a mid-sized university, so a number of people in my family were teachers. So that seemed to be the path I would take.
You got there eventually. You took the long way around, but you got into teaching.
I did. And so I can't remember how I was introduced to podiatric medicine. I think I was at Duquesne University at the time, and I gave some thought to it. And, I remember my sports career that I think the team physician in college was an octogenarian family doctor. And it didn't matter if you had a small contusion or an ACL, it was 2 weeks off, ACE wrap, and ice. And so I saw a lot of injuries that probably weren't treated as well as they should have been. And so sure. I think the sports part caught my interest. Mm-hmm. And so, Yogi Berra said, you come to the fork in the road, you take it. So mm-hmm. I went in the direction of podiatric medicine and went to what was OCPM, now Kent State, did my residency in Toledo. And then I went into private practice back in my hometown in Western PA. And I remember distinctly going into my wife one evening and I said, I'm going to be disappointed in myself if all I do is private practice. And, mm-hmm. for most people, that really is a good fit for them. But, I developed all these skills at Duquesne and then at University of Pittsburgh, and I didn't want them to go to waste. And so that's when there was a position available at Des Moines University. I applied, was offered the position, and then Dr. Richard Ryan, who I consider my professional mentor, he gave me the opportunity to serve as an interim dean. And 3 months later, he said, I'm not doing a search. And I was stupid enough to say, yes, I'll take the position.
Yeah, because DMU wasn't what it is today. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit. And that's a big leap coming from Western Pennsylvania halfway across the country. So what made you take that leap? Because you're moving to Iowa. People who've never been to Iowa have a certain stigma or perception of Iowa that's proven false when they get here. But what made you take that leap?
I think it was just that was the position that I liked the idea. I knew that the DPM students took classes with the DOs, and it was the only program that did that. And I thought, if this profession ever really wants to make a mark academically, I think it it has to be, similar and on par with allopathic or osteopathic colleagues. So that was my attraction. I didn't really look at location. I knew Iowa had really good wrestling.
Well, they did back then. We've been struggling compared to Penn State recently, but we
Right.
keep finishing a
Runner up.
distant second. Yeah, exactly. Second's the first loser. So speaking of that, so that kind of dives into a different topic about parity and how that relates between the fields of DPM and DO and MD. You hear a lot of people talking about parity, which to me is number one, a pipe dream because the fields are completely separate and they're separate for a reason. But what are your thoughts on maintaining that professional relationship like you saw at Des Moines University between the podiatry college and the DO college, but expecting us to pass the USMLE or be a fully licensed physician? I think that's just such a leap there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been more a proponent of develop your own identity, but when there are opportunities to share curricula or opportunities in residency training, that's where you can I don't like the use of the word parity because you're actually asking another profession to say, yes, you are the same as us.
Right.
And Jeff, I think you and I both know that's just not going to happen. And
Right.
so I think it's been a bit of a mistake for the profession to sort of seek parity rather than to continue to develop its own programs and make those as strong as possible so that no one really can question the education and the training and experience of a podiatric physician. So I've not been on the parity bandwagon.
And I think that there's an important distinction there in that I view it more of as a two-way street as opposed to DPMs wanting to be like Big Brother. I view it more as if we don't want parity because that would negate the necessity of a separate field, meaning if DOs or MDs took our boards, they would not pass because they are not educated like we are in biomechanics and surgery and as in detailed of anatomy as we are. So it's a two-way street in that we shouldn't be trying to look for parity for them and they shouldn't be looking for parity with us. I think sometimes people think of parity as looking up to Big Brother. Oh, I want to be like them. But I think it's more, like you said, two different pathways that serve their own purpose individually.
Yeah, I think it's important to maintain your own identity as a profession, and more isn't necessarily better in terms of doing exactly what MD students or DO students are doing in their curriculum or their training. So,
Right.
and I think we're kind of at a crossroads now as a profession in terms of making that decision as far as what is a podiatric physician, because there's a number of challenges I think that you're aware of in terms of applicant pool and things like that that need to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. So in terms, you've been doing this long enough, and we'll circle back to the early years at DMU as dean, but you've been doing this long enough now that you've seen the good years and the lean years in terms of applicant pool and quality of applicants and the ups and downs that come along with that. Do you think this is just a cyclical thing that's happening? Like El Nino and La Nina are cyclical. Like everything seems to be cyclical as we go through life. Or do you think it's, if there are more DO and MD schools opening, then more applicants are maybe going to drift towards them and not have as many DPM applicants?
Well, I think the latter, and that is I think at one time it may have been somewhat cyclical, but now what you're looking at, you have fewer students who actually are matriculating at undergrad, fewer students in the sciences, and therefore the pool nationally for health professions is down, and it's going to be down for a while. So in that sense, I don't think you can sit here and say, give it 3 or 4 years and we think the applicant pool will come back. I think there needs to be some sort of intervention other than say, let's wait it out and let's go to a bunch of undergraduate schools and talk about podiatric medicine. Jeff, I was looking at an article the other day, and it was talking about the number of MD and DO students after they graduate that go into surgical specialties,
Mm-hmm.
and it's around 20%. But going into medical school, about 70% think they're going to go into a surgical specialty.
Mm.
So what we do with podiatric medicine is, let's say nationally we have 500 students who enroll. I know it's a little bit more than that.
Mm-hmm.
If you just look at the numbers, a lot of those folks, I don't know that they necessarily want to do surgery, or maybe they want to do surgery, but somewhere along the line, these MD and DO students figured out, I don't think a surgical specialty is right for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but think that that affects a certain number of podiatric students as well. And so somewhere along the line, either one of two things. Number one, you define yourself purely as a surgical field,
Mm-hmm.
or you somehow highlight the non-surgical aspect of the profession as well, and hopefully there's a patient population and reimbursement that a person can have a healthy and wealthy lifestyle. I mean, there are extremes. I mean, one thing is a profession goes away and MD and DO graduates go into podiatric residency programs. That's
Right.
that's the extreme.
Right.
I think other things are, there's always a need for physicians. Is there a way to not necessarily expand the scope of practice from an anatomical perspective, meaning, let's get up into the knee, but is there a way that you can manage and be paid for your own patients, from beginning to end in terms of their care related to the foot and ankle, meaning I can manage their diabetes, I can manage their hypertension, and I can get paid for that,
Mm-hmm.
when I have them in the hospital. So maybe changing the scope of practice, not so much from a musculoskeletal perspective, but from more of a general medicine. I mean, years ago, I think the DO grad would do a 1-year internship and they would be called a general physician. Now they do 3 years in their family practice. You would
Mm-hmm.
think that somewhere in podiatric medical education, you could tuck that type of training into the undergraduate as well as the residency training and expand the scope of practice, because I think the status quo is not the answer, and waiting it out.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times we are managing these patients. It's hard enough to get medicine to admit a patient and they say, well, you can consult us. And so half the time podiatry is managing. They are primary on their own patients. So we kind of are doing those things without the acknowledgement or respect of doing that itself. But in residency, we were primary on the majority of our patients if they needed admitted. So we're already kind of doing that somewhat, but it's
Yeah.
a ton of extra work. So.
Yeah, it is a lot of extra work.
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned the non-surgical versus surgical component of the field, because there's a subset of our profession who will only refer to themselves as foot and ankle surgeon, which I find bizarre. You went to podiatry school, you are a podiatrist, your letters after your name say Doctor of Podiatric Medicine, not Doctor of Foot and Ankle Surgery. And bringing up the point of there's a wide number of people who don't want to do surgery, and that's perfectly fine because there are many patients who either don't need surgery or don't want surgery, and you can be a specialist without being a surgeon as well. What are your thoughts on the people that are so obsessed with calling themselves foot and ankle surgeon versus podiatrist? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you need to accept what you are and what your title is.
Right.
And so I think trying to distance yourself from the profession probably doesn't help the profession in the long run.
I agree.
I think that's a big point. Whereas if you are doing strictly foot and ankle surgery, you can do a lot to promote yourself as, if you want to call yourself a podiatric physician or a podiatrist, that's fine. That's what we are. A podiatric surgeon is a foot and ankle surgeon, but the term podiatric is there, like you mentioned, Jeff. It's in the degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it a little bit strange, to be honest with you, but I just find it, I don't know if it's a little bit of like insecurity, or I think that's probably what it is
Probably.
insecurity. But in my opinion, the only way, if you think of podiatry as, historically a certain way, and the general public thinks of podiatry a certain way, the only way to change the interpretation of that is to call yourself a podiatrist or podiatric surgeon, but educate them and show that you're doing all these things that aren't the same as what they used to be. If you draw away from that name, it's just complicating things and making it more confusing to me.
Well, and in the process of doing this, we're giving up, care to other healthcare providers, whether it be, physical therapists or PAs, dermatologists,
Mm-hmm.
orthopedic surgeons. So we need to be really careful about, what we're labeling ourselves or defining ourselves as a profession.
I
I mean, you
agree.
have these two schools of thought. There's primary care, podiatric care, and there's surgery, and somehow they need to get together and come up with a common theme in terms of what this profession is all about and what it represents.
Sure. I find it interesting when we start talking about applicant pools, because I think if you look at it from two different point of views, one side might think of it as a positive, one side might think of it as a negative. So if you're an administrator, like you were at the school, then you care about applicant pool because you want to fill your class. There's budgets that revolve around this, filling your applicant availability, your seats. But in the general public, if there's fewer people graduating, that's less competition. And some people would say that we need fewer podiatrists. I don't necessarily know. I'm not educated enough to say whether that's true or not. I never had a problem getting a job, but I guess it depends on the person. But I think it's interesting to think about that same thing from two different perspectives. If you're at the school, you want a higher applicant pool, you want to increase your numbers, you want to do all the fill your seats. But in the general public, maybe they don't want as much competition.
What's interesting is if you look at professions, specialties such as dermatology or even orthopedic surgery, those are in high demand, and yet the number of graduates from residency programs really hasn't increased or kept up with the demand. And
Mm-hmm.
so the number of MD and DO graduates, let's say, that go into a dermatology program every year, I believe is pretty close to the number of graduates from podiatric medical schools annually. And that really hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, maybe we look at the number of residency programs that are available and say, you know what, we're just going to graduate 600 DPMs a year, period. And we have enough residency programs to provide them the training that they need. And then I think you need to look at the schools and say, why do we have one school that's approved for 125 students, another school that's approved for, 40 students? I mean,
Right.
I think you take that 600 or whatever that number is
Yeah.
and say, we want to give each of these students the best education possible, the best clinical training possible. And so, I mean, that's where like an accrediting agency needs to come in and say, we're really going to take a hard look at
Yeah.
the training you're providing. And so you as an administrator, you can make adjustments and accommodate whatever number of students you can admit annually. If I can admit 50 annually, I can make that work.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of the schism, is that you have CPME has approved a range from 40 all the way up to 125.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody can educate 125 students. So why are they still at 125, even though they only take a fraction of that? So
Right.
I think we need to look at professions like dermatology and orthopedics and say they really aren't increasing in their numbers, and we certainly have a finite number of residency programs. We don't have to worry about an applicant pool if we determine that, hey, we're only going to graduate 600 DPMs a year. We're not going to increase that. The demand will be there for them. but that takes a lot of soul searching and hard decisions on the part of accrediting agencies as well as the administrations at the various programs.
Yeah, I think if you made it something that was very objective, not subjective, objective, and you just said, here's the number of students that you're able to take based on this formula, whether it be the number of students that you've taken the last 5 years and we average that out, or a percentage of your applicant pool, or whatever it may be. Someone smarter than me can figure that out. But at least if you went down the line and there was no, because the schools that take a lot more students are the schools that have been around the longest. It just is a fact. So they're almost like grandfathered into these numbers, and it just doesn't ever seem to change. But if you could come along and make it something that's very concrete and say, well, here's the amount that Arizona and Western and DMU and Barry are allowed to take, and here's why, I think you'd have more success with that. Just rather than coming in and being like, we're cutting yours in half and we're doing this,
Right.
if it seems haphazard.
Yeah, I think you have to have those metrics to evaluate. I do know that the current numbers that each program has, barring DMU, during my time we increased from 53 to 60. I think it's the only school that has received an increase.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, when you look at those kind of numbers, I don't think. Well, what CPME did to arrive at those numbers, I guess I was getting at, was it must have been 15 years ago, or the last time we had a real downturn.
Mm-hmm.
CPME, it was junk science. They looked at what was your graduating class size over the past, I think it was like 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
What was the average? And that was the number they gave you, because DMU used to take 80. When they did that equation, they came up with 53. And that stuck until we increased to 60. So maybe they ought to do that again. And it's based upon, you're not going to hire too many faculty. It's expensive. You're not going to have, certain bells and whistles. You're going to try to stay within what your financial budget is. And administrators are able to do that. So I don't know why they wouldn't maybe try to do something like that. Maybe make it a little more scientific this time around.
Right.
But make that readjustment.
Okay. You and I, we're in charge now, and we're taking over.
Taking over.
We're going to do it. We're going to do it. So let's go back to the early days at DMU. Yeah. So you came on board.
Right.
And I was young, so I wasn't there. So you're going to have to tell me what it was like. But I know that that DMU was not what it was thought of when you left. So what was it about DMU that wasn't fantastic? And what were the concrete changes that you thought needed to be made over your tenure to make it what it is today?
Yeah, I think the big thing was early on was it had this long history of strictly being osteopathic medicine. And so, you're just not going to open a college of podiatric medicine or a college of health sciences and like, ta-da, podiatry's here.
Everyone's excited.
Right.
Wow, we got a podiatry school.
Right. And so part of it has to do with the performance, of the students.
Sure.
And so I think early on, although they took some classes with, the DO students, maybe their performance wasn't what they had hoped it would be. And so it almost set up sort of a tiered system. Maybe the board scores weren't as strong as they're not as what they are today. And so I think in my mind, this College of Podiatric Medicine faculty were upset because, we're not being recognized by the institution. And my response was, we have to give them a reason to recognize us. And you do that through your performance, through excellence. And so I think part of it was just motivating faculty and students that, the path to success was through performance excellence. And I think once that message started to get through, I think you started to see a change in the mindset of members of the Board of Trustees and the administration toward the College of Podiatric Medicine as well as the College of Health Sciences. I think the other thing had to do with administrative changes. And so, I think very highly of Dr. Richard Ryan. I think during his tenure, which was only 6 or 7 years, I think he really tried to make it a point that, no part is greater than the whole, and we're better off being identified as a university rather than being identified as a college of osteopathic medicine and a couple of these decorations just hanging off the side.
Right.
And so I think
Which is interesting because I grew up in Des Moines. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I
yeah,
wanted to throw this in here. So it used to be called College of Osteopathic Medicine, and I drove past every single day, and I had no idea what this place was. If you would have asked me, I would have said something with bones. Osteo sounds like bones. They're doing something with bones in there, but I
yeah.
have no idea what it is. So there's a branding thing there too, just as an opinion of someone who grew up in Des Moines. I didn't even know what the heck that place was, and I drove past it every day.
And I think the administration at the time was comfortable with that. And then you had Dr. Ryan who came along, and he really preached, academics to increase the performance of students across all programs on the national level. And then you had Governor Branstad, who served as, and just he himself, I think, brought some degree of notoriety to Des Moines University. And then you have the current president, Dr. Angela Franklin, who I think has done a lot of work in terms of building bridges within the community, the
Yes.
new campus. And so I think you had um, a number of presidents who came along, and they brought with them their own set of skills that elevated Des Moines University to what it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how do you go about changing student performance? Because if it's not a destination that students want to go to because it's not highly thought of, how do you get students convinced to go there that are academically able to elevate the impression of the college?
I think the question really has to do with who you're surrounding those students with,
Mm-hmm.
and the faculty that you have on board. I can remember, talking to students in a faculty meeting years ago, and the issue was, we're being treated like second class, citizens, and I think my response was, people can treat you like that, but don't accept it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't accept that you're anything other than a first class program. But that takes work to prove that. So I think you have to motivate students, and you have to motivate faculty, and it's sort of that flywheel effect. If you can build some momentum, and have a couple of groups of students who buy in, and faculty who buy in, all of a sudden you're saying, hey, we're getting really good board results. Hey, we're getting students going to these top residency programs. And
Mm-hmm.
then it becomes easy, because once you've established a reputation, I think then incoming students, I think they expect to do well.
Sure.
I would always tell students, I never said, boy, I hope you pass the boards. It was, I know you're going to pass the boards. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it is just instilling in the student that you have confidence in them, that they can do it. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
was a big part of my time, is working with faculty as well as myself, and instilling confidence in students that they can be successful there.
Mm-hmm. So you hired my wife. You were the person that
I
hired
did.
Ashley to join Des Moines University. I just want to tell you the story of going back before she got hired, because I don't know that you know this story. So her and I were both working for orthopedic groups down in Tennessee, and she had come and applied to the university. They had a vacancy and there was an opening, and she had applied and came back and interviewed. And we were sitting in the parking lot of a Dick's Sporting Goods, and her phone rang, and it was you. And I looked at her, I was like, oh, you're going to get hired. And she's like, oh, I don't know. But, if anyone's met her, she's very hireable. She's very likable, the opposite of me. And so she picks up the phone and she's like, hello? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, oh, yeah. No, I understand. And I was like, oh, you didn't get hired? What? Are you kidding me? And she hangs up the phone and she's like, yeah, they hired Sean Grambar. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, yeah, I guess that makes sense, because she had spent a month with him. And if anyone knows Dr. Grambar, he's fantastic. And it made a whole lot of sense for him to get hired instead of her. I always said it would have been weird if the student who rotated with the attending got hired instead of the attending. But then eventually it did come around that it worked out. There was another vacancy and she got hired. But we just thought it was so funny because we thought like, oh yeah, you're getting hired, no problem. Like you're a shoo-in. And then we're like, nope, I guess not.
Um, it's always pretty easy just to send an email or a thank you letter saying
Thanks,
thanks,
but
but
no
no
thanks.
thanks. But I held Ashley in such high respect. I always tease Graham Bart and Ashley, and I say, you two are in my top 5 students ever. And
Yeah.
I say, but I'll never tell you where you are. So just because I hired Graham Bart, that doesn't mean he was in a higher position than Ashley. So you can let her know that, okay?
All right. Well, we don't want to get in a big head, but I just thought it was funny because we were just like, oh, we're moving to Iowa. And they're like, nope, never mind. All right, just unpack your bags. We're
Well, I
going to
know. I
stay
mean,
here for a while.
it was shortly thereafter that another
Yeah.
position opened, and so I sort of kept my fingers crossed that, gosh, I hope I didn't burn any bridges by not hiring her the first time around. That's a
No.
funny story.
Yeah, it was.
So
So
every time you go into Dick's, do you guys have like a reaction?
Yeah, we haven't been back once. Not once. So when you left, you handed the reins to Kevin Smith,
Right.
who is seemingly running it into the ground. I know he'll be listening. Dean Smith, sorry about that. Had to say that. But what was that transition like? Because Dr. Smith was at the school for well, not that I was there longer than 4 years, but my entire tenure. And I know he was at the school for a long period of time. So what was that like, kind of handing the reins over to someone else? I suppose you knew that it would be in good hands, but it's kind of your baby that you've formulated over so many years. It's got to be hard to be like, okay, now you take the ball and run with it.
No, actually, it was pretty easy.
Bye.
Yeah. No, I knew. I mean, I knew Dr. Smith was really capable. He served as associate dean for clinical affairs, which really is a big part of the education. He paid attention to things we did. He participated in a lot of things that we had done. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the success that we had as a program, as a college, wasn't on one person. I mean, it was a group of people and students who bought into a formula that seemed to work for us and seemed to be a template for some of the newer, not so much today, newer schools of podiatric medicine. Although the LECOM school very much looks like the other programs that are affiliated with osteopathic medicine. But no, it was a pretty easy transition, to make.
Yeah, and I've heard you say before on Dean's Chat, shout out to Dr. Jensen and Joe on Dean's Chat, you said that you have an exit strategy right before the site visit.
I did. I'm
getting out of here.
I just didn't. I wanted to give him a year and a half. I just didn't want to. You reach a point and you say, I don't know that I can do much more. That I want to do that much more. And so that was sort of the point in my life. And there's some other things that I wanted to do.
Yeah. So what has post-retirement life looked like for you? You're a grandfather. You're into CrossFit. You've got a lot going on, I'm sure. But
yeah, so I mean, one of the things about going into retirement is, I mean, it's a big transition, and so it's have something in mind. And so for me, I'd always wanted to write a memoir about my daughter-in-law, my son, and my granddaughter. So I started almost immediately, and I finished that book at the end of November, and it was published in December. And then, Jeff, still had a little gas in the tank, and so I opened a consulting business. That's what everybody does when they retire; they become a consultant, right?
And you make more money sometimes.
Yeah, I've worked with DMU. I've worked with LECOM. In terms of assisting them kind of work their way through the accreditation process. You mentioned the CrossFit. I work out 4 or 5 times a week. I didn't read enough when I was younger, and so I do a lot of reading. But I think most of my time I appreciate the most is just hanging around my granddaughter, and she's playing softball now at pretty high level for an 11-year-old. So it's
Nice.
fun to watch her. But my advice to anybody who's about to retire is you should have two or three things lined up that you want to do. I mean, I can honestly say I'm doing what I want to do. Are there times when I'm bored? Yeah, there are. There are times I was bored when I was dean. So nothing's really. But then anytime I got bored, a student or faculty member would do something and I would become on board quickly.
Yeah, there was always something going on, wasn't
Oh,
there?
always.
Yeah. So talk about the book for a little bit, because I
Yeah.
think not everyone's going to know that story. I know it well, but
Yeah.
why don't you kind of talk about that a little bit, and why you decided to write the book?
Yeah. So about 4 months before my son was to marry Laura, she had an event that they initially thought was a stroke, which would be kind of unusual for someone of that age and that fitness who had no medical history. But
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks after her initial event, after she had changed some physicians, they diagnosed her as a glioblastoma. And so she was referred to the Mayo Clinic, undergone multiple surgeries, I think three major brain surgeries,
Mm.
radiation, and multiple bouts of chemotherapy. And Laura survived 27 months, which is pretty significant for individuals who have that diagnosis. And in the meantime, Laura's best friend contacted Nathan and Laura and said, do you want a child? Laura couldn't carry, obviously, because of the chemotherapy and the surgeries.
Right.
And they thought about it and they agreed. And so Kara, Laura's best friend since I think it was second grade, carried for them. And Carolyn was born 4 months after her mother had passed away. And so that's kind of what the story is all about. I actually wrote it for my granddaughter so that at some point in time she would understand, everybody's mindset and science, um,
Mm-hmm.
destiny,
Yeah.
God's will, all coming together in terms of bringing her into this world. And so I wrote the book really for her. But there's some interesting things in there I think that we learned along the way, and that was our interactions with the healthcare providers. I mean, we saw a broad array of approaches. Um, some were excellent, exceptional relationships with the physicians. Others maybe weren't as strong, and so I think that there are some lessons that healthcare providers, particularly students. I mean, I don't make much of a shameless plug. I don't make much off the book or anything, but I think
Mm-hmm.
there's some lessons in there of how you as a healthcare or me as a healthcare provider should respond when people are in these sort of difficult circumstances. And then the book kind of goes on, life after Carolyn was born, and up to a point when she's like 5 or 6 years old. So it was fun to write. It's a pretty emotional book.
Mm.
Anybody who reads it always contacts me and said, "Yeah, I smiled, I cried, and I laughed." And so
Mm.
that's kind of what the book. Those are the emotions it tried to evoke with the book.
For sure, and it's an amazing story. I think that's a fantastic resource for Carolyn, and those memories that you have are never going to be more fresh than if you kind of write it, early on versus a distant memory of how things were. I think the interesting aspect from maybe our perspective or anyone listening to this podcast is what you said, in that there is an interpretation. Every patient you see, I don't know how many patients I saw today, 30, 34, 35, I don't know. But every single patient that I saw today went home and has a memory of that event. I don't have a specific memory of each of the 35
Right.
patients, but they have one specific memory of, were you nice? Were you on time? Did you give them good information? Did you let them ask questions? Did you sit down? Did you look them in the eye? Did you give them their results? Did they feel like a person? And I think that's kind of extrapolated's not quite the word. It's exponentially important when you're dealing with something as profound as a brain tumor. Maybe I'm treating someone for an ingrown nail. Certainly not the most important thing in their life. But when you have a brain tumor, that is the most important thing in your life. And you are trying desperately to find any amount of information that might be new or different or helpful in any way. And it's easy to fall into this pattern of, well, how many patients do I have today? And even tomorrow, I have multiple surgeries, and I can rattle off. I have a fifth met fracture. I have a MIS Achilles repair. I have an ankle fracture. It's easy to not think of them as much as humans as you do as things to check off. Okay, I'll do this case. I'll do this case. I'll do this case. But it's interesting to get your perspective, and maybe you can expound upon that in her and Nate's perspective of interacting with those physicians.
Yeah, I think the best example is her oncologist, both in Des Moines. Dr. Angela Sondre is here in Des Moines, and Dr. Yoon, who was the oncologist at the Mayo Clinic. And so Dr. Is of Asian background. He is recognized, I think, nationally, maybe internationally, for expertise in brain tumors. And when they first met him, he was, I think, about ready to go on vacation or a conference or something. And it was kind of a hurried encounter. And I remember them saying, we're just not really sure about, Dr. And he said, well, I'll see you when you get, from your surgery. So after surgery, they waited a few weeks and then she started her chemo. But I mean, over time, their relationship, I don't think I've ever seen anything as tight as what I saw between those three, and the mutual respect they had for each other. So, at first appearance, as a patient, you certainly want to give the clinician, the physician, the benefit of the doubt as well until proven otherwise. I mean, it got to a point where he actually would allow them to take a picture of them and post it on Facebook. It just, and ordinarily you wouldn't do that. And after Laura passed, Nathan he called Dr. and he told her. And about 3 weeks later, he sent a letter, and the letter actually is in the book. Completely unexpected and very much appreciated. That doesn't mean you write a letter to every patient, but there are times, regardless of your specialty, where as a physician, you can really step up and help someone. And so I think that letter really helped Nathan, and I think all of us through that process, to know that here's a person who was committed to Laura and will continue to be committed until, as he said, that dreadful disease is cured. And so I think it's important that, you as a provider understand exactly what you said, Jeff. You may not remember that patient, but they're going to remember you. And, you got a couple of shots at it. If things don't go well the first time, you can build a relationship over time. And I think that was probably the classic example. And the same thing with Dr. Sondre, who's a DMU graduate, by the way. She would call on a regular basis, give updates, extraordinarily caring individual. On the other hand, they did run into some healthcare providers that were very short and terse with them. They didn't communicate very well, and there clearly was a difference in terms of how they perceived the providers who took care of Laura.
It's an interesting perspective, and I wonder what those providers would say if you asked them. Do you think that they would acknowledge that they were short and terse, or would they have a completely different interpretation of that interaction? Because there are certain days where I'm running behind and I'm just trying to keep up, and I'm sure I was not my best with those patients. Right. Again, I'm drawing a very large distinction between brain tumor time with patient and whatever I'm seeing them for. That doesn't mean that it's an excuse. It just means that's a very important thing that they're seeing people for. And And it's difficult when you walk away with that interpretation of your interaction.
But I think as a healthcare provider and as a podiatric physician, I mean, if you're seeing 25, 30 patients a day, you're dealing with 25 or 30 different personalities, and you can't deal with everybody the same. And so for
Right.
some individuals, you probably need to be much more straightforward and more
Mm-hmm.
commanding as compared to others where you can engage in more of a discussion or a conversation. So a lot of it has to do with the patient as well, and how do you modify your approach so that you maximize what you do for that patient to benefit them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said earlier, Dr. Smith has taken over and has been doing a fantastic job with the College of Podiatric Medicine and Surgery at DMU. What would you envision that the next phase of life at DMU post Dr. Yoho looks like? What would you envision DMU getting to the next level? I mean, in my mind, they're already the number one school. Maybe I'm biased, but at least one of the very top schools. But what do you think we can do or he can do to carry on that tradition forward?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm most proud of the college at Des Moines University is the graduates and the number that are in leadership positions, yourself with the podcast and reaching out to people. And so, and the amount of research that's being done by our graduates.
Sure.
If you go to ACFAS or APMA or Midwest or even the state conference, particularly the national conferences, the number of graduates who are participating in posters, submissions, or oral manuscripts. I mean, it really is almost dominated by DMU graduates. Now the DMU, so I think at one point, we had a really good thing going. I think in terms of research. I mean, yourself and I and Dr. Verdaxis published a paper on a Jones fracture and healing. It's got about 25 citations, which isn't bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think transitioning to the new school and COVID had a pretty dramatic effect on the level of research. And so to me, institutions that really become recognized, it's based upon the research that they're doing. And so for me, I think the next big step for DMU would be, how do you take a relatively small faculty and increase the research productivity that the institution and the program is putting out there. So to me, I think that sort of highlights an institution is their research being published not only in their own journals, but when you start infiltrating even other national journals with high impact factors. And so I think that's how you get to the next level, but that's really hard based upon the time commitment. So, I mean, it would be nice to see someone in charge of research for the College of Podiatric Medicine, but I don't know from a financial perspective if that's possible, at all. But
That makes a lot of
that's what I would
sense.
wish for the college to produce, become more productive in the area of research.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When you were involved in the admission process for students, do you find that any of their metrics, I guess MCAT is a old but maybe more so newer metric because now everyone takes the MCAT, or GPA would be predictive of success? Could you draw a linear line between finding a student that was an applicant and be like, that one's going to be successful? Or were you constantly surprised? Like, I thought you were destined for Nowheresville and you proved me wrong. Do you think that you can be predictive of incoming students or not really?
You should probably ask Dr. Smith that. I think he wrote his thesis on exactly that. So my
Right.
understanding, we actually had done, a study that looked at admissions benchmarks. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think there were, I don't know, close to 500 students who had been enrolled in that study. And I kept thinking it was maybe the physical science at the time of the MCAT that was a predictor. and then the science GPA. But those things have changed over time, and so I think the answer is yes, but I can't tell you specifically what those are. But I think Dr. Smith's study has that information, his thesis in there in terms, and he actually added, he codified, he didn't personally do it. He used resources to codify undergraduate institutions. So there was a point system for, elite, highly selective, and average undergraduate institutions. But I think the answer is yes. It's just a matter of looking at that data.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the future of the profession? So if we were gonna put on our, I don't know, look into the crystal ball in the future of the profession, because in doing this podcast, I've interviewed lots of different people. I've become much more integrated into the field than I was before the podcast, and I've met a lot of very impressive people. When I take a step back and I look at the profession, I'm very impressed with the people that are in the profession, what they're doing, their devotion to the profession, and where this profession is maybe compared to even 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I'm not saying this because I think the profession really needs to do anything, but what do you see as the future of the profession? Are we perfect as we are? Do you think we need to take the USMLE? I don't, but do you see any changes in the profession moving forward? You kind of talked about surgical versus non-surgical.
I think there's still fragmentation in the profession and across some of the national organizations and some of the board certifications, and it certainly would be nice to see representatives from all those different organizations thrown in a room and say, don't come out until you have figured out, what this,
or you kill each other.
Right. Last man standing. We'll go with that opinion. Okay.
Come out of the octagon.
Right.
That might be more likely. I don't know.
Yeah. So to me, I like the advancement the profession has experienced over the past maybe 20 years, particularly in residency training. But somehow there has to be a transition of all those, all the expertise that's in the profession, and how do we elevate them beyond the profession? Because it's great to say within this, small pond, we have all these big fish. But how do you get that into the ocean? How do you get that into other ponds so that people outside of podiatric medicine recognize the value of the profession? That's and maybe that's something in some sort of organizational plan they can come up with. How do we make headway so that we're recognized beyond the pond of podiatric medicine?
That's interesting to think about. I think we are on the ascension. Maybe I'm biased, but we are ascending. I can see a growth of the profession, and I think that we are headed in the right direction.
I don't mind the smaller number of graduates, and you mentioned that, Jeff, early on in the conversation. I just want to make sure that those students are getting the best education possible. And if that means schools have to take fewer and to educate them better, I think we should do that. And I sort of go back to that dermatology analogy, and that is they aren't really increasing. And so they're taking the cream of the crop. So great. We have, say we get up to 1,000 applicants. All right. You're still just taking 500 of them, the best 500 there are, rather than having 720 seats available and having, 650 applicants.
Yeah.
That hurts us from a public relations perspective. And so I think there has to be some adjustments related to the number of graduates relative to the number of applicants.
I agree with you, because at some point you don't want to be putting out inferior podiatrists into the field, and or accepting people because you can and knowing that they're going to fail out. You accept 2 years of their tuition or a year and a half of their tuition dollars, knowing they're probably not going to make it through because they weren't a very good applicant. So I agree with you. Well, thank you very much for joining me tonight. I appreciate you hopping on and giving us some time.
Oh, my pleasure. I always like to talk about my career at Des Moines University after being the dean. And it's interesting. CrossFit is now has partnered up with called the Global Health Project, which they're trying to get healthcare providers of all different backgrounds to go into gyms, not necessarily to join, but to maybe go through a few workouts and then to talk to their patients who they feel could, participate on those types of movements to encourage increased level of health. So I would encourage any listeners out there that if you're a healthcare provider, look into your local CrossFit gym, the Global Health Project, and you might find some of your patients would do well with that type of fitness activity.
I was just telling one of my elderly patients today she should try to lift a giant tire. No, it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
She might lift it, but you don't know where it's going to come down. That's the problem.
Fall back down on her foot.
There you go.
Get some more business. No, I think that's interesting. So thank you for hopping on with us, with me tonight, and joining Paw Patrol. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, or more importantly, check out the book, they can check it out on Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Yep. And actually, if you're in the Des Moines area, West Des Moines Library carries it. So it's starting to yellow a little bit. So at least I know a few people are looking at it.
Yeah. It's called Life After Death, the Laura and Carolyn Yoho story. So check it out, everybody. A fantastic read. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode of Paw Patrol with your host, Dr. Jeff Dykes, joined by Dr. Yoho. Until next time.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. Opinions expressed are those of the content creators and do not represent any employer or entity. The information shared is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice or used in any legal capacity, including establishing standards of care. All efforts have been made to comply with HIPAA regulations. No guarantees are made regarding the accuracy of statements or opinions provided. Interaction with the podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. Please enjoy this podcast responsibly.